62 years old, 10 below zero, and Clara Vance was on her knees, chiseling through solid ice to bury her dead mother's last seeds in frozen ground. Everyone on the street said the same thing. She'd lost it. By July, those seeds would grow into something that made grown. Gardeners stop mid-sentence and stare. But first, you need to see how impossible this looked. Snow moved sideways across the porch, thin and dry, the kind that stings more than it settles. In Clara's palm sat a small glass jar, the seeds inside a deep crimson brown, like dried blood pressed into rice. Heritage bell peppers, her mother's peppers, grown on the same half-acre for 41 summers before the woman who grew them stopped being able to kneel in dirt at all. Clara had kept that jar in a kitchen drawer for 3 years after the funeral, unopened. Some part of her had decided that as long as the seeds stayed sealed, her mother's garden hadn't really ended. Barnaby, a gray tabby with one torn ear and zero patience for sentiment, sat on the porch rail watching her with a flat disapproval only a cat can manage. "People pay good money for cryotherapy, Barnaby," Clara said, not looking up. "These seeds are just getting the luxury spa treatment. Ice bath, very trendy." The cat blinked slowly and said nothing, which was about the response she expected. She'd read about the winter before this one. A polar vortex had dropped down over the Midwest in January and killed early plantings from Ohio to the Ozarks. Farther out, growers across parts of the UK had watched a late freeze wipe out tender starts that were supposed to be safely past the frost line. Everyone kept saying the same thing, that the old calendar didn't work anymore, that the ground didn't warm up when it was supposed to, and then it swung hot too fast, and nobody's seedlings could keep up with weather that refused to follow a script. Clara had a theory about that. She'd worked 30 years as a botany technician before she retired, cataloging seed viability for a university extension program, running germination trials in climate chambers set to mimic conditions nobody in a normal garden would ever choose on purpose. She knew things about seeds that most home gardeners never had a reason to learn. She knew, for instance, that cold wasn't always the enemy. Sometimes cold was the instruction. She took the trowel and knelt at the edge of the raised bed her late husband had built the summer before he died, cedar boards gone silver with weather. 2 inches of solid ice had formed over the soil, glassy in a way that caught what little sun was fighting through the clouds. She chipped at it with the trowel's edge, small precise strikes, until she'd opened a gap wide enough to work a finger through. Then she dropped 3 seeds into the frozen ground and covered them. Down the fence line, a curtain moved in the window of the next house over. Arthur Bell had lived beside Clara for 19 years, ever since he retired from the county extension office himself, a different department, soil conservation, a man who read seed catalogs the way other men read box scores. He came out onto his own porch a few minutes later in 3 coats stacked, one over the other, looking like a man dressed for an expedition to somewhere colder than his own backyard. "Clara," he said it the way he always did, half greeting, half warning. "Tell me you are not planting peppers in February." "I am planting peppers in February." He laughed, short and disbelieving, and crossed toward her fence. "Capsicum unknown. Tropical plant. Needs 80-degree soil to so much as think about germinating, and you're putting it under 2 inches of ice." "That's not gardening, Clara. That's botanical suicide." "Noted," she said, and kept working. A few people passing on the sidewalk slowed to watch, the way people do when someone appears to be doing something foolish in public. A woman walking a beagle actually stopped, tilted her head, and said something to her husband behind a gloved hand. Clara felt the eyes on her back and didn't turn around. She'd been watched before. She'd been doubted by better botanists than the neighbors on Larkspur Street. She just kept chiseling through ice, 3 seeds at a time, moving down the row. By the time she reached the last few feet of the bed, her knees had gone numb through the canvas and her fingers had stopped feeling much of anything beyond the cold metal of the trowel. She didn't stop to warm them. She'd learned a long time ago, both in the lab and out of it, that the moment you let discomfort talk you out of finishing something, you rarely go back and finish it later. So she kept going, row by row, jar emptying slowly into frozen ground, while a small crowd of curious neighbors formed and dissolved and formed again along the sidewalk, none of them quite brave enough to ask her directly what she thought she was doing. By dusk, every seed in the jar was in the ground, and the only thing left on the porch was an empty jar, a cold cup of coffee she'd never gotten around to drinking, and a cat who still hadn't decided whether to be impressed or embarrassed on her behalf. The first attempt was a disaster, and Clara would be the one to say so plainest. Late January, before the ice jar seeds even went in, she'd tried a simpler experiment, burying a batch of seeds straight into snow-covered ground with no protection at all, just seeds and soil and whatever the sky decided to do. 3 weeks later, she dug them up to check. Half had rotted into a gray paste. The other half showed the telltale fuzz of mold creeping along the seed coat. Slugs had gotten to a few, somehow active even in the cold snaps, chewing through the softened outer layer like it was nothing. Arthur naturally heard about it before she told him. Small street, small talk. "I heard about your little snow batch," he said over the fence. Not quite gloating, but close. "Rot?" "Rot," she admitted. "So you'll stop." "So I'll adjust." That was the difference between failure and a data point, and it was a difference Clara had spent 30 years learning to trust. A failed trial wasn't an ending. It was information about what the trial had been missing. The raw burial method had failed because raw burial gave the seeds nothing but cold and wet, no insulation, no drainage, no protection from the organisms that thrive in exactly those miserable conditions. So she went to work on the second trial, and this one she kept quieter. She started pulling materials from around her own house the way her mother used to, back when buying garden supplies wasn't really an option, and you made do with what a farmhouse kitchen produced. Crushed eggshells, saved in a coffee can under the sink, added calcium to the soil, created a rough textured barrier that slugs hated crossing. She mixed in dark compost, nearly black because dark material pulls in what little heat the pale winter sun offers and holds it longer than plain dirt ever would. She layered dried leaves and straw over the top for insulation, and over a portion of one row she set old glass jugs with their bottoms cut away, upside down, forming tiny greenhouses barely bigger than a fist. The jugs were the part she liked best, honestly. Each one sat over its row like a tiny glass dome, catching whatever sunlight made it through the clouds and holding a few extra degrees of warmth inside, just enough to matter without cooking anything on the rare afternoon the sun actually broke through. She checked them every morning before coffee, brushing snow off the tops, tilting each one to make sure meltwater wasn't pooling where it could refreeze around the stems. It was slow, unglamorous work, nothing like the dramatic gesture of kneeling in the snow with a jar of seeds. Most mornings it was just her, a flashlight, and 40 small glass domes standing in a row like something out of a science fair nobody had asked her to enter. She explained none of this to Arthur. She barely explained it to Barnaby. What she was really doing had a name, though it wasn't one she used out loud yet. In alpine botany, seeds that come from plants adapted to harsh, high-elevation climates often need a period of sustained cold before their internal chemistry will even permit germination. It's called stratification, a natural process that mimics winter passing into spring, and it does something specific to a seed's outer shell. The hard coat that normally keeps a seed dormant and protected slowly breaks down under repeated freeze and thaw, microscopic cracks forming in a process much gentler than it sounds, called scarification. By the time real warmth arrives, the seed isn't just dormant anymore. It's primed, ready to move the moment conditions allow, with none of the delay a springtime planted seed has to work through first. Peppers aren't alpine plants. Everybody, including Clara, would tell you that. But her mother's strain wasn't quite an ordinary pepper anymore either. 41 years of saving seed from the toughest surviving plants each season, the ones that came through a late frost or a dry spell others didn't, had done something to that particular lineage. Clara had noticed it years ago in her old lab work without fully naming it. A slightly thicker seed coat, a slightly longer natural dormancy, traits that looked almost like an accident of selection but weren't, not really. Her mother had never studied genetics formally. She just saved seed from whatever refused to die year after year, until refusing to die became the plant's whole personality. Clara wasn't trying to make anything sprout in February. She was trying to wake something up slowly enough that when it finally broke ground, it would come up stronger than anything planted the ordinary way. She remembered her mother saying something close to that once, years before any of this, standing over a different raised bed on a different cold morning. Clara had been maybe 12, annoyed at being pulled outside before school to help mulch a row that already looked finished to her. Her mother had knelt down anyway, packing straw around stems that didn't need it as far as Clara could tell, and said the kind of thing a child forgets until she needs it decades later. Anything worth keeping learns to survive the part where it looks like nothing's happening. Clara hadn't understood it then. She wasn't sure she'd fully understood it in the drawer, either. 3 years of leaving that jar sealed, rather than risk finding out the seeds inside, had already given up. March brought the test she hadn't planned for. A freak ice storm rolled through in the second week, the kind meteorologists kept calling unprecedented for the date. Temperatures dropping to 10 below overnight across a stretch of the country that didn't usually see numbers like that outside of January. It matched what growers were reporting from the UK and Northern Europe that same season. A wobble in the jet stream throwing cold snaps into weeks that used to be predictable. Clara's raised bed disappeared under another sheet of ice, thicker this time, and stayed frozen solid for 4 straight days. Arthur came by on the third morning with 2 mugs of coffee, steam rising off them into air cold, enough to bite. He handed one over the fence without a word at first, just stood there looking at the ice-locked bed like it was something that needed a moment of silence. "Clara," he said finally, gentler than his usual tone, "I think it's time to pack it in. Nobody would blame you. That storm would have killed plants in a heated greenhouse." She wrapped both hands around the mug and looked at the ice a long moment before she answered. "They aren't freezing, Arthur," she said. "They're sleeping with an alarm set." He didn't have anything to say to that. He just shook his head, the way a man does when he's decided arguing further isn't worth the breath, and went back inside to his own warm kitchen. By mid-April, the snow had finally let go for good, and what it left behind wasn't encouraging. Clara's raised bed looked like a wound. Bare, soggy brown, streaked with the ash-gray residue of melted compost and old straw gone to mush. Up and down the street, other gardeners were already setting out their seedlings, healthy 6-inch starts they'd been babying under grow lights since February, stems pale and a little leggy from reaching toward artificial sun. Their beds looked like gardens. Clara's looked like a grave. She sat on the porch steps one evening with a mug going, cold in her hands, and let herself feel the full weight of it. Maybe Arthur had been right all along. Maybe she'd taken 3 years of hesitation and turned it into one act of stubbornness, burning through the last of her mother's seed on a theory that made sense in a climate chamber and fell apart the second it met real weather. She thought about the coffee can of eggshells, the compost she'd hauled by hand, the jugs she'd cut and set with the kind of care she used to give lab equipment worth thousands of dollars. All of it sitting under mud that showed no sign of anything alive. 2 doors down, a family she barely knew had a bed already thick with leafy green starts, the kind of tidy, uniform rows that come from a garden center flat, and a calendar followed to the letter. Clara had walked past it that morning on the way to get her mail and stood there a beat, too long enough that the woman watering it had waved, a little uncertain, before going back to her hose. Clara had waved back and kept walking, and the whole way home she'd turned the same thought over. Everyone else's garden looked like a garden. Hers looked like a mistake she hadn't been able to admit to yet. Barnaby climbed into her lap uninvited, which he rarely did, and she scratched behind his torn ear without really thinking about it. "Maybe I just wanted an excuse to talk to her again," Clara said quietly, to no one who could answer, even if it was through dirt. She didn't go back out to the bed for 2 days after that. She told herself it was because the ground was too wet to disturb. Mostly it was because she wasn't ready to see nothing there and know for certain. On the 3rd morning, she finally went out with a hand trowel and a small magnifying glass she used to keep in her lab kit, more out of habit than hope. She knelt at the edge of the bed, brushed back a thin crust of dried mud and wood ash, and looked closer at the dark compost layer beneath. There, barely the height of a fingernail, a pair of leaves, deep purple-green, tightly curled and pressed close to the soil like they weren't sure yet whether the world above ground could be trusted. She didn't call out. She didn't cry, not right away. She just sat back on her heels and put a hand flat against the cold, wet dirt, the way you'd check on someone sleeping to make sure they were still breathing. Over the following week, more came. Not all at once, not in the tidy, uniform rows the neighbor's greenhouse starts had managed, but steadily, unevenly, each one arriving on its own schedule like it had been waiting for a private signal only it could hear. What Clara understood, and what none of her neighbors could see from over the fence, was happening below the surface, not above it. A pepper seedling started indoors under grow light spans, its first weeks reaching upward, chasing light that's never quite strong enough, building a tall, thin stem and a shallow, cramped root system because there's nothing pushing it to do otherwise. A seed that spends the winter in the ground does the opposite. With no artificial light to chase and cold soil below it, the plant's early energy goes almost entirely into the root, driving it down and outward, searching for warmth and water, building a foundation before it ever bothers with height. The insulation Clara had layered in back in February had done exactly what she'd hoped. She checked it later with a soil thermometer out of curiosity more than doubt, and confirmed what her old training told her should be true. Under the dark compost and straw, the root zone was running, roughly 15 degrees warmer than the open air just above it, a small pocket of stubborn warmth that had kept the seed alive and slowly working through every freeze the winter threw at it. By July, the difference wasn't subtle anymore. It was the whole street's topic of conversation. A heat wave rolled through that month, the kind that turns hoses into a full-time job and leaves greenhouse raised starts wilting by early afternoon, no matter how much water goes down at their roots. Arthur's plants and most of the neighborhoods struggled through it, leaves curling at the edges, growth stalling out just as the season should have been hitting its stride. Their root systems, shallow from an indoor start, simply couldn't reach far enough to find water the surface hadn't already lost to the sun. Clara's plants didn't stall. They kept climbing. The taproots, her winter-sown seedlings, had built back in the cold months, now ran deep enough to draw on groundwater. The heat wave hadn't touched, and the plants above ground showed it. Stems that had started as thin purple threads had thickened into something closer to a small trunk, sturdy enough that Clara didn't bother staking them the way she staked everything else in the garden. Along those stems, peppers came in by the dozen, then by what felt like the 100, glossy, thick-walled, a deep waxy red, exactly like the ones in her mother's old photographs. Word got around the street the way it always did, one porch conversation at a time. The woman with the tidy garden center rose came by first, standing at the fence with her arms crossed, asking Clara flat out what she'd done differently, because her own plants had gone from green to brown in the space of a week, and she couldn't figure out why. Clara walked her through it, the eggshells, the dark compost, the deep winter roots, and watched the woman's face do the same thing Arthur's had done back in March, disbelief sliding slowly into something closer to respect. By the second week of the heat wave, 3 other households on Larkspur Street had asked Clara the same questions, and 2 of them had already started digging out compost bins they hadn't touched in years. Arthur showed up at the fence on a Saturday morning holding one of his own plants in a nursery pot, a flimsy thing he'd picked up from the garden center to replace one of his heat-struggled starts, and he stood there for a long moment just looking at Clara's row. "I don't understand it," he said, and for the first time in 19 years of knowing him, Clara heard something other than certainty in his voice. She walked over, snapped a pepper free from the stem with a soft twist, and handed it across the fence. It sat heavy in his palm, thick-walled and cool, despite the July heat, nothing like the thin, pale offering still in his other hand. "You told me it was botanical suicide," she said, not unkindly. "I did. Turns out it was just patience with better timing than mine used to be." He turned the pepper over once in his hand, studying it the way he used to study a soil sample, and didn't argue. That was as close to a concession as Arthur Bell had ever offered anyone. Clara sat on the porch that evening with a full basket of peppers beside her. Barnaby curled at her feet for once instead of judging her from a distance, and thought about how much a season like this one resembled a life. Nobody plants a seed hoping for the frozen months. Nobody wants the dark stretch where nothing visible seems to be happening, where the neighbors start whispering and the doubt creeps in, even from inside your own chest. But it's often exactly that cold, uncertain period that builds the kind of root system strong enough to carry a heavy harvest later, the kind of harvest that looks impossible, right up until the moment it isn't. Her mother's seeds hadn't just survived the winter. They'd been strengthened by it, the same way Clara suspected she had been too, these past few years of grief that had felt, for a long stretch, like nothing but frozen ground. She'd kept one pepper back from the basket, set on the porch rail next to Barnaby, seed still inside it. Next February, she already knew, she'd be back out there with the trowel and the ice, starting the whole slow process over again. Not because the science demanded it, because some part of her, Mother's garden, only stayed alive as long as somebody kept planting in them, cold and trusting what couldn't be seen yet. If this story brought a smile to your face, or made you look at winter gardening a little differently, take a second to hit that subscribe button and tap the bell so you don't miss the next one. Share it with a friend who thinks their growing season has to end the moment the first frost hits, and drop a comment below with your hardiness zone. Have you ever dared to plant before the frost cleared? Let's grow together.